When the Second World War began in 1939, the British once again produced a large amount of comic propaganda to aid the war effort. H.M. Bateman applied his comic talents to highlighting issues such as energy saving on the home front. And Cyril Bird, better known as Fougas, created any number of posters for the Ministry of Information. This included the now famous Careless Talk Costs Lives campaign. And Fougas's quirky minimalist cartoon style proved particularly effective in getting the serious message across. New Zealander David Lowe had been warning about the rise of fascism in Europe for several years in his cartoons for the London Evening Standard, and he continued with his mission throughout the 6 years of war. So effective was he that Lowe actually featured on Hitler's death list. The USA didn't join the fight until 1943 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, but they too used many of their cartoon heavy hitters to help out. Children's author Dr. Seuss in particular produced many cartoons which enthusiastically targeted the enemy leaders. Predictably, much of their material focused on Japan, but whatever the subject, all of it was of a consistently high graphic standard. Perhaps most significant was the exceptional and distinctive work of Polish-Jewish émigré Arthur Cizek. Although his reputation had been made with serious religious art, his mockery of the enemy was both heartfelt and lavishly rendered. As for the other side, the German propaganda machine created many anti-Semitic cartoons, which were used to convince the population that the Jews were to blame for everything. Fortunately, sanity prevailed and peace was finally restored in 1945. Cartoonists in America and across Europe put the war behind them and did their best to return to business as usual. The Adventures of Tintin had been published with only local interest in Belgium since 1929, but Hergé's style and technique had matured considerably through repeated drawing, and it was the post-war years which saw Tintin become one of the first European comic creations to succeed in a rapidly expanding international market. There were others, such as Lucky Luke by Maurice de Bavere and Robert Velter's Spirou strip, but their success was confined to French-speaking Europe. The sexually provocative cartoons of Niso Ramponi, also known as Cremos, first appeared in Italy's Il Travaso magazine in 1948, and his cover work in particular transformed it into a far more modern and visually stylish affair. The slick American influence in his work was obvious, and his anatomy, posing and expressive way with line made his illustrations hugely popular throughout Italy and southern Europe. And at the other end of the style spectrum, fellow Italian Benito Giacovetti also found fame in his own country at least with his resolutely absurd cartoon characters, which although clearly modernist had absorbed many of the characteristics of early 20th century American cartoons. In Russia, the stat that Crocodile was still avoiding the labour camps and keeping on the government's good side, with a younger generation of cartoonists producing well-drawn but soft-centred satire. And in post-war Britain, John Gilroy's cartoon ad campaign for Guinness was an object lesson in how to sell with humour. Like Tintin, they had first appeared before the war, but in the late 40s and early 50s, these posterised cartoon classics of light-hearted comedy were seen just about everywhere in the UK. The loose, expressive line work of newcomer Ronald Searle had first been showcased with his harrowing drawings of life in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, but his subsequent fame was mainly due to his wildly comic drawings, especially those he created for the St. Trinian's series. Somewhat surprisingly, his far from mainstream style and rather bleak humour, which owed a debt to the work of George Grosz, quickly came to dominate 1950s British media. The cartoons of Carl Giles featured for several decades in the Daily Express from the mid-40s onwards. He was a contemporary of Searle's, but his style was far more orthodox and precise. His strength was in his ability to evoke very believable, accurately drawn environments, and to populate them with instantly recognisable British archetypes. Gerard Hoffnung had fled Germany for Britain as a teenager, and over the next 2 decades he became immensely popular as a cartoonist and broadcaster. His work was almost exclusively related to his beloved subject of music, and his seemingly casual line work and quirky surreal humour nodded emphatically in the direction of Edward Lear. Norman Thelwell's decorative and well-drawn images also found favour around this time. Most of his work appeared in Punch over a 25-year period, but it was his Pony Club drawings and remarkably well-rendered watercolours which made him a household name. Irish-born caricaturist Edward Hines is now largely forgotten, but throughout the 50s his work, which owed a debt to Al Hirschfield, graced the covers and pages of Men Only magazine, which attempted to inject a little glamour into British life. By far the biggest comic strip success of the period was American, of course. Peanuts by Charles Schulz first appeared in 1948, and just as Tintin had done, the characters evolved through repeated drawing before their final resolution as the iconic images we now recognise. Schulz was one of a growing number of cartoonists who were rejecting more complex, laboured imagery in favour of subtle humour and simplicity of drawing. Far more traditional was the brush and pen work of Walt Kelly's Pogo Possum strip, which used its bayou setting to parody current affairs. And Al Cap's Little Abner used a hillbilly cast and setting for similar effect. Such was its success that the strip spawned a very popular stage and movie musical. But popular as they were, the strips were always going to take second place to animation in the public's affection. By this time Disney Studios had become an entertainment empire with an army of illustrators, animators and cartoonists, and films such as 1953's Peter Pan and 55's Lady and the Tramp were huge international box office successes. And the 50s saw a quantum leap in the popularity of Warner Brothers' Looney Tunes. They based their reputation on 5-minute shorts, which were far more manic, angular and frequently less dialogue-heavy than Disney's offerings. Their first star was Bugs Bunny, created by Tex Avery, but he was rapidly joined by Daffy Duck and a large cast of other characters created by the likes of Robert McKimson, Bob Clampett and Chuck Jones. Tom and Jerry were created for MGM Studios by William Hanna and Joe Barbera in 1940. They made over 100 shorts in an 18-year period before the partners moved on, leaving the characters to others who never could recapture the quality of the originals. Although UPA Animation were not as big as the other outfits, they were arguably the most distinctive. The terminally short-sighted Mr. Magoo and human sound effect Gerald McBoing Boing were their most popular creations. All UPA characters and the worlds they inhabited were modernist and geometric in their approach. And that same avant-garde dismissal of tradition could also be seen in the comic illustrations of Jim Flora and Cliff Roberts. Both had worked for UPA, and the cubistic comic style they popularised inspired many cartoonists who followed. In a field of one at the time, Saul Steinberg's spidery line work and surrealist humour became popular in the early 50s with the sophisticated urban readers of the New Yorker magazine. His rarefied minimalistic illustration dispensed with conventional ideas of technical skill and had the quality of subconscious doodles. For Steinberg and his readers, it was all about the subtlety of the humour. Cut from more cheerfully vulgar cloth, Mad magazine was unleashed on an unsuspecting public in 1953. Created by Harvey Kurtzman and Will Elder, Mad immediately became a success, particularly with young American males. Unlike other satirical magazines, Mad was entirely pictorial, and it featured the work of a range of talented cartoonists such as John Severin, Wally Wood and Jack Davis. All of them were manic and irreverent in their humour, and all were steeped in the traditions of comic art. In Britain, comics were still exclusively for kids. The Beano had started out in 1938 with some exceptionally lifeless cartoon work, but in the 50s it made its way to the top of the pile, due to the abilities of two cartoonists in particular, who had joined their ranks in the early part of the decade. Ken Reid had a light and highly controlled touch with the pen, and much of his work was far more detailed than the norm in this context. Leo Baxendale's technique was far less highly rendered, but he was no less successful, with a long list of characters to his credit. Both brought a more mischievous and anarchic tone to their comic creations than previously seen. Although we had them, newspaper comic strips for adults had been far less popular in Britain than in the States. But in 1957, the anti-hero layabout that was Andy Capp was created by Reg Smythe, and it didn't take long before national popularity translated into global success, including the American papers. And a couple of years later, the French had similar success with Asterix the Gaul. Written by René Goscinny and illustrated by Albert Uderzo, this well-drawn and meticulously researched series quickly broke out of its national boundaries and proved you didn't always have to be American to be internationally popular. Nevertheless, it's with the Americans that we bring this instalment to its conclusion. In the later 50s, the idiosyncratic and deeply psychological cartoons of Jules Feiffer were first published in New York's Village Voice. For Feiffer and his readers, it was really all about the neurotic and generally bleak humour of his dialogue. Nevertheless, his apparently random and deceptively impressionistic line work was capable of creating very believable characters and situations. And it wasn't coincidental that he went on to write and direct similarly neurotic movies. BC by Johnny Hart also appeared at this time, and this comic strip took its cue from Schultz's work on Peanuts in its fusion of scribbly, apparently casual but expressive drawn style and sophisticated psychological humour. In 1958, William Hanna and Joe Barbera resurfaced with their own studio using modernist limited animation techniques. The outfit created simple characters and backgrounds which enabled them to meet the short deadlines of TV scheduling. They had instant success with the Huckleberry Hound Show. Among others, this show also featured Yogi Bear, who was quickly given his own series, which rapidly eclipsed the success of Huckleberry. And of course, many of these 1950s success stories and the innovations they brought about would continue to evolve and influence others through the 1960s and beyond. And that's where I'll pick up the story in the final instalment of The Art of the Cartoon.